All right, welcome back. This is part two of today's daily Bible reading with Daily Bible with Chris. Glad that you're joining me. Hopefully, you got a chance to either watch earlier our reading of Second Chronicles 35 through Ezra chapter 3. So today we finished up Second Chronicles by reading the last two chapters in that book, and then it transitions into the book of Ezra, reading those first three. So if you've not already watched that video or you've not had a chance to read those five chapters, I would encourage you to do that first before watching this, because we're going to go back through and give some further explanation of each of the chapters that we read. And so I'd encourage you to do that. But if you want to follow along as we're breaking this down, we're going to be back in Second Chronicles chapter 35. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much. I would appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and maybe give this channel a subscription and subscribe to it. If you're watching on Facebook, again, you can like, share, comment, and really appreciate the support the channel is having. But as we mentioned earlier in our reading, we're picking up at really the closing scenes of the nation of Judah. Of course, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, has long passed off the scene, and there's a remnant living in Judah, but it's passed off the scene. King Josiah is king. He will be the last of the good and godly kings, and really only has kind of one slip up at the end of his life that is recorded in Scripture for us. But for the most part, he's a very good and godly king, and we know that set up he had set up back, of course, the temple worship and the proper worship, and had reestablished the covenant between God and the nation of Judah, as well as those inhabitants from some of the tribes in the northern kingdom that had made their way to Jerusalem for worship. And so he's going to observe a Passover similar to how Hezekiah had also established a Passover, which they had not celebrated since the time of Samuel, even predating David and Solomon. And we're going to see that continued here. So just in chapter 35, it tells us that Josiah observes the Lord's Passover. Now, different from Hezekiah's Passover that took place in the second month of the year, which was actually a month after it should have taken place. He's going to do this in the right month, the first month of the year. They kind of start off their year with the celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Passover, the reminder of the Exodus, which is interesting. We're reading this because we're going to be in the book of Ezra, which is in a lot of ways the story of the second Exodus, of them exiling from the Babylonian captivity, and of course the Medes and the Persians back into the land. But we don't want to jump ahead of ourselves. So he's going to establish this observance. We're going to see this is going to happen. He's going to organize all of the priestly divisions for their responsibilities for the slaughter of the Passover lambs, and telling them to consecrate themselves. They're to serve as they're supposed to serve. We see Josiah the king himself donating 30,000 sheep, lambs, and goats toward the Passover slaughter and sacrifices and such, and the Passover meal, because they would spill the blood and then they would cook up these many of these animals, and they would serve it as part of the Passover meal that they would all enjoy, plus several thousand other cattle. His other officials, the priests and the Levites themselves, are also going to give toward this as well. So noticing from the king to the governmental officials to the Levites and the priests, so don't ever say, pastors, religious leaders don't have to give financially. We see here the Levitical priests and such giving toward this as well, and donating. And so from this, we see this great Passover meal that's happening. It's going to take place. And of course, they're doing it. And we see something different. It's not normally a practice of the Passover to have music, but we see in verse 15 that the singers, those that are descended from Asaph, of course, who had been one of the musicians under David, as well as and such, they're going to include music in this, as well as he has the gatekeepers set up at their positions. Even while this great festival is going on, you don't want to let your guard down, so they're keeping an eye out as well, and they're going to make preparations for that. And it says that no Passover had been observed like it in Israel since the days of prophets the Samuel. So even this observation, or this observance of the Passover, is even greater than Hezekiah's, which, if you remember, Hezekiah, that went for 2 weeks. It's only supposed to be a 1 week festival. It went for 2 weeks, but this is considered even greater. And so we see in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, when he's approximately 26 years of age, this Passover was observed. And it was of such great importance and national importance that it's recorded here. And then we come to the end of Josiah's life. We see a situation here where the king of Egypt, a king by the name of Necho, he is in alliance with the Babylonians at this point. The Assyrian Empire is starting to become very weak. Babylon is ascending. They are going to be the new world power. And so there's this relationship there against the weakened Assyrians. And Nico is going to march out to fight and to battle, to go to battle, and eventually will battle the Babylonians themselves, and will be defeated at Carchemish. I may have misspoken there about him being allied with the Assyrians. He's marching up and will battle with the Babylonians. Let me put that. But in doing that, he marches through Judah and on his way there to battle the Babylonians. And so Nico and Josiah are going to have a bit of a conflict, and Nico's going to send messengers saying, what's your problem? I have no issue with you, Judah. I'm going up here to deal with this Babylonian threat. And in fact, he's going to claim that God told him to do what he's doing. And you're holding me up. Don't oppose me. If you oppose me, God will destroy you. Now, whether he meant the God of Israel or whether he's talking about his own gods, we don't know. But we know this was a way that the God was trying to get to Josiah and tell him to back off and to leave Nico alone. It was part of God's plan. But Josiah wouldn't back down. For whatever reason, he doesn't heed the warning given to him by King Necho from Egypt. And so a fight's going to take place in the valley of Megiddo. We know that valley because it's going to have be a very significant location in the end of times. The Valley of Megiddo is where the Battle of Armageddon, from which we get the name Armageddon, is going to be fought, a very bloody fight. We see that this is going to happen there. There's a battle. And interestingly enough, Josiah goes into battle disguised. So we don't know, is this a lack of faith? We don't see Josiah inquiring of God what he should do. We see Josiah making a bit of a foolish. So this would be the one blip on the resume here for Josiah. He's going to go into this battle. For whatever reason, it doesn't appear that he, appeals to God, prays to God, gets any direction from God. He feels a little bit like his nose has been put out of shape by this force coming in, these Egyptians coming into his area, regardless of the reason for doing it. And so but he goes into battle disguised. Who was the last king that we remember being disguised going into battle? King Ahab, who did that. He tried to avoid God's judgment by being disguised, and we see this here. And very similar. It's ironic. One of the great and godly kings of Judah is going to meet a very similar fate to one of the most wicked kings of Israel, King Ahab. There's a battle. The battle's happening. Archers are going to shoot their arrows at King Josiah. He's going to be struck, severely wounded, and bloodied. So bloody that they get him out of there on his war chariot. He's put into a second chariot, and then they get him out of there. They bring him back to Jerusalem, and ultimately he is going to die. And Josiah at a very young age, he's in his 40s when he's killed here and dies after I think that's right. Let me make sure I'm telling you that. Let me make sure I'm giving you that time frame correct. Well, he's just shy of 40 years of age. He reigns 31 years at 8 years of age. So I was a little off there, but he's still a fairly young man, had many years ahead of him. But in God's plan and such, he's going to make a foolish decision, go into a battle he should not have gone into, and it's going to cost him his life. And there's going to be such great mourning and weeping over the death of King Josiah, because he had kind of brought some pride and feelings back into there. There was a great love they had for King Josiah, that it says the male and female singers began to sing their funeral dirges, and that they write these special dirges are written just for the crying and the weeping over the death of King Josiah. And so he's going to die, and he's going to be the last of the good and godly kings. And so this is going to set the stage for the ultimate Judah's fall and judgment from God. And so Josiah passes off the scene. Chapter 36, his son Jehoahaz, who was not the oldest, he was not the next one in line, is going to become king in the place of Josiah. And it says that the people, so this was like some democratic uprising or a mob uprising. They don't want to recognize who was the actual successor. So they're going to put Jehoahaz in as their king in place of the father. He's 23 years of age, and he's only going to reign for 3 months in Jerusalem. Very short reign. In fact, the king of Egypt, Necho, is going to depose him, and is going to put and cause them to pay him a tribute, a very large tribute. And so he's going to basically get rid of Jehoahaz. He's going to take him back to Egypt, and he's going to put his brother Eliakim and make him king over Judah. He's going to be basically a puppet king of Egypt. He's going to do that, but ultimately uh, you know, Egypt himself is eventually going to be defeated by Babylon, and they're going to cease to be an important player in this drama. But at this time, they still have a little bit of power, and they change Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But Jehoahaz is taken back to Egypt. Jehoiakim becomes king at just 25 years of age, and he's going to reign for 11 years. And we see we read this phrase here: He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. And King Nebuchadnezzar, after defeating King Necho, after kind of pushing him out, he's going to come against Jerusalem, come against Judah, and in fact, Jehoiakim is going to be captured, and he's going to be. It says here to be taken. He's put in shackles to be taken back to Babylon. But if we can compare this with the passages in Second Kings and some other writings, it doesn't appear that Jehoiakim never makes it to Babylon. In fact, most believe he was taken out, and then something happened, and he was killed on his journey. May have even been before he even got out of the city of Jerusalem. But Jehoiakim's going to pass off the scenes, and he's not even. They don't even mention his burial. Okay, I mean, basically, he has a very unspectacular reign outside of losing to both being a puppet of Egypt, and because of that, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and for the first time shows his force there in Jerusalem. It's not, and this kind of begins the beginning of about a 20-year period of the Babylonians coming in and invading and taking and doing, and ultimately going to lead to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. And so then Jehoiachin is 18 years old. He's the son of Jehoiakim, so not to be confused. Jehoiachin, Chin, is going to become king when he's 18 years old, and he's only going to reign for 3 months and 10 days. So very short reigns here. He also is going to do what is evil in the Lord's sight. And it tells us that in the spring, Nebuchadnezzar sent for him and brought him to Babylon along with the valuable articles. So he's also going to be led away, brought back to Jehoiachin is going to be brought back to Babylon, where he's going to basically live out the rest of his life in Babylon. But because of his survival, he is kind of that surviving lineage of David that will continue through his line. That he will die in Babylon. It's prophesied that he will die in Babylon. He dies in Babylon, never sees Judah or Jerusalem again, but he at least is allowed to live. And then Nebuchadnezzar sets up his brother Zedekiah becomes king over Judah and Jerusalem. And Zedekiah is 21 years of age when he becomes king. So all these are in their 20s, very young men. He's going to reign also for 11 years in Jerusalem. And he also is going to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. He's not going to humble himself before God, nor the prophet Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah is warning him, don't turn to God, repent. Destruction's coming. If you don't repent of your ways, destruction's coming. He's going to ignore Jeremiah. He's going to treat Jeremiah very badly. And through this, and in fact, he's going to be tricked by some of the false prophets and such in that day. Zedekiah sees himself as like the patriot the George Washington, so to speak, going to lead to their freedom from Babylon or from Nebuchadnezzar. And so he's going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, and because he's listening to others. He's not following the warning of Jeremiah that he should just go along. This is all part of God's judgment. And he continues to harden his heart against God and the Lord. He doesn't repent. And so all the leaders and all the people and such are going to do what is wicked, what is evil. And so he is going to rebel. It's not mentioned here, but over in Second Kings, it tells us that he's going to be captured, he and his sons, Zedekiah and his sons. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar has his 3 sons killed in front of Zedekiah, and then his eyes are put out, so that the last thing Zedekiah sees on this earth is the death of his sons. Very kind of a very cruel thing to do, but showing ultimately. And it's at this point that Nebuchadnezzar is going to make his final sieging of Jerusalem. There's been a series of this. There's been raids. There's been things taken back. We're giving you a very abbreviated point, but there's a final in 586 BC. So 580 so years before Jesus. We're going to see here the ultimate laying siege to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to fall, and many are going to be killed. And in fact, the Babylonians are going to, it says here, they have no pity on the young men or the young women, elderly or aged. They're going to just kill many of them. They're going to take all the treasures of the temple, large and small. They're going to destroy the walls of Jerusalem. They're going to be destroyed, and they're going to lay destroyed for a long period of time. The temple itself will be desecrated over a couple of days and eventually is destroyed and burnt, and the treasures of the temple are taken out. And it's at this point that many of the great treasures of the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, the table of incense, the table of the presence, all these big articles, they disappear from history and never seen from again. Some of the smaller articles, the goblets and the bowls and such, they're going to come back later on. But the Ark of the Covenant and all these other things that had been built and set up for the temple are going to pass from history, and fire up your own conspiracy theory as to what happened to those things. And so we're going to see that this is going to happen. Babylon's going to lead for the final time another group of people into exile. They've been doing this over a period of time, but this will be the final. There'll be a remnant of the very poor farmers, and some vine keepers and such are going to stay in the land. There are going to be people from other nations that will kind of assimilate into the area, but generally speaking, it's the majority will be taken into Babylon. They're going to live there for approximately 70 years. And this was a part of the prophecy that the people of Judah had not been keeping their Sabbath for the land. If you remember, Moses had, in the law of Moses, it said every 7 years they were not to plant any crops. They were to give the land a year off so that it could replenish and refresh, and then they could start back again. They had been ignoring that for about 490 years. So you figure the math here. God says, well, during these 70 years of the country being desolate, that's you paying me back for my Sabbaths that you didn't give me as you were supposed to. And so we see that happening. And then at the end, and it kind of jumps here for us because we don't hear much more about Babylon at this point. We will hear about that in books like Daniel and such, because of course Daniel's been led off to Babylon at this point. He will live out his life in Babylon along with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and others. But we're going to jump ahead there. So this takes place in 586. Okay. Jerusalem's destroyed. The temple is destroyed and burned out and broken down and whatever. It's just left in ruins. And about 50 years later, Babylon itself is going to fall, and a new empire is going to come up, the Medo-Persian Empire. We read about this. There's a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar by the name of Belteshazzar is going to have a big festival, and God's going to announce judgment on him. He's going to say, basically, you've been weighed, you've been found, you've been found wanting, and tonight your souls, this is going to be the end of it. And the Medes and the Persians come in and destroy Babylon. They come in through. It's quite amazing. They are going to come in through the strategy of the Medes and the Persians, basically route the Euphrates River into a swampy area. It causes the Euphrates River levels to go down because one of the main gates, the Euphrates River ran through the city of Babylon. So the water level is going to drop to a point where people can wade in. Soldiers could wade into the Euphrates River under these large gates, double door gates, which are actually prophesied about in the scripture. We'll mention that here in just a minute. And under Cyrus, history knows him as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus and the Persians, as we end the chapter, Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians are going to defeat Babylon, and now they are going to acquire that area. Now we have a new world power on the scene, the Persian Empire, as we end the chapter. And the reading of the close of Second Chronicles and the reading of the beginning of the book of Ezra, which we're going to go into now, are almost identical. And so there again, it leads to the belief that is probably Chronicles and the book of Ezra written by the same person, Ezra. Now, who is Ezra? Ezra is a priest from the tribe of Levi, a descendant of Aaron. He specifically is a scribe, one of those that would be tasked with the diligent writing of the scriptures and taking the scrolls and writing them exactly, making exact copies by hand. If anything was written wrong, they would tear it up, they would destroy it, they would break the pencil they'd been writing with, they would start all over. It had to be, there's a whole process there but it had to be exact. Like the numbers of letters had to match up. Talk about a very detailed person. And so Ezra is going to write this book here, and it's further kind of documentation of the return of the people after their 70-year exile into Babylon, and now, of course, into the Medo-Persian Empire. There's about 1 million Jews living in that Babylonian, area now controlled by the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus is king, and the Persians had a different, whereas the Babylonians and the Assyrians would take people out of their home country and bring them to their place, and they would bring people from outside to re-inhabit the areas they had conquered. They thought that was a better way than letting the people stay in their own land, which could breed rebellion. The Persians had a much laxer or much more friendly to the conquered people's policy, they would allow a remnant of them to either remain in the land or to go back into the land, and they would try to basically uh, keep those people happy, being under the control of a foreign power, and they would be better citizens that way. And so they would try to give things to them, allow them to worship the way they want to worship, those kinds of things. And so we're going to see here that that Cyrus is going to proclaim that the people of Judah can return, those that want to can return back into their homeland for the building of the temple. For the building of the house of the Lord, or the rebuilding of the temple. And he's going to proclaim that. He's going to write it out. He's going to make it a proclamation. It's going to be read throughout the empire. And in fact, it's so much so that he's going to give financial, there's going to be financial support from the Persian government to make this happen. And so you're going to have basically three main characters during this second Exodus back into the land of Canaan, back into the promised land, back into the land of Israel and Judah. You have three. You have a man by the name of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and then we're going to meet later a man by the name of Nehemiah. And Ezra is going to be that. You're going to have like this government official, Zerubbabel. Nehemiah, of course, is going to be the king's cupbearer, who's going to be the one responsible for the rebuilding of the walls. And Ezra is going to be the one focused on the rebuilding of the temple, which makes sense since he is a priest. And so we're going to see this. There's offerings as we get into Ezra chapter 1. We see he's made this proclamation. There's financial support. They're going to send back many of the goods, the things that had been taken out of the temple are going to be sent back. And so we see all these silver articles. They're numbering them, and they're taking all that back. There is a person here mentioned by the name of Sheshbazzar. He and Zerubbabel are possibly the same person, or if they're not the same person, just two different names. They're working very closely together, because Sheshbazzar is mentioned as kind of the governor there in Judah, and so he's going to. So you've got the support of Cyrus in doing this, and then in chapter 2 we have a listing. Now here's the interesting thing: you got about 1 million or so people, Jews, living in this Babylonian Medo-Persian Empire at this point. Only about 50 to 150,000 of those Jews are going to actually come back into the land. The scriptures tell us about 50,000, but that's only listing the heads of the families, not all the women and children and such. So it's somewhere between 50 to 100, 150,000 people, but it's still a very fraction, like a 10%, a little over 10% will actually go back into the land. And there's an important thing to be said there. But we're going to see here, not to really go through it, but we see some names here that could be, we see Zerubbabel mentioned in chapter 2, Jeshua, who is the priest. He's the high priest. That spelling, Jeshua, is the same as we get Yeshua, from which we get Joshua, but it's also in Greek would be pronounced or spelled or said as Jesus. Jesus is the Greek form of Yeshua. Okay, same name, Joshua, Jesus, same name, Jeshua here, same. So it's kind of interesting. You've got a priest by the name of, in essence, Jesus, working on the building of the temple there. And then it mentions a person by the name of Nehemiah. This is not the same Nehemiah or Mordecai that we're going to hear about later on, but we have a listing of all the descendants and the numbers that are coming in here. And there's a few discrepancies on some of the numbers compared to other passages and such, but that could just have been scribal error. For some of these things that could happen, even as diligent as they were. Somebody didn't carry the one or whatever it might be. But we see all of this: the singers, the Levites, the priests, the temple servants. We see all of that coming in here. We also have a listing of those who were descendants of the priests, but who could not verify their genealogical line. They're not allowed to come. They're not allowed to serve just yet. They have to wait. There's a process for them to try to prove and to get God's permission. We see here mentioned the Urim and the Thummim. This was the black and the white stone that the priests would use as a way to try to divine God's will. And sadly, that will no longer be something that's going to be done. In fact, in this rebuilding of this temple, that's going to be known as the second temple, it'll fall way short of the grandeur of Solomon's temple. It will be built on the area where the original temple was and such, but it will not be nearly as grand as this one was. It'll be much smaller than the original Solomon's temple was. And there are going to be items missing from this temple that were in the other. Namely, the Ark of the Covenant won't be there. The Shekinah glory of God does not come down in Shekinah glory like the presence of the cloud to inhabit this. The fire of God coming down is not going to be there. And the Urim and the Thummim is not going to be there as well. And so it's going to be Still going to be the temple. It's still going to be a place where they can worship, but it will not be. And it'll be a constant reminder that it's not as grand as it could have been because of their rebellion against God. And so we see through that the rest of chapter 2. Again, we see the listings and the lineages and such. And this is important. And we get this number around 50,000. But again, those are the male heads and leaders and such, and the servants and such, but it doesn't include the females. So that's why that number may be more like 150,000 people, but still far probably. And why is that? Probably because a lot of the people had, hey, they'd been in Babylon now a generation or two. Things were going well in the where they had been in Babylon, and now the Medo, and it's even going better now in the Medo Persian Empire. They're probably content, and they didn't want to go. Who wants to pick up and move back and have to rebuild? Right? I'm happy with my house. I'm happy with my job. I'm happy with what I've got going on. And in fact, we find that the Levitical priest, an even smaller portion of them are going to come back, which is very sad. That even the priests and such, the ones who should have been leading by example, fewer of them are even going to come back in during this time, sadly. So, but we see this being done. We see all the gifts, the collections, the offerings the people are giving toward the rebuilding. And then in chapter 3, we see the first thing they're going to build on the ash and rubble of the earlier temple is they're going to rebuild the altar. Why is that important? Well, to start beginning offering sacrifices. That's important before anything else. And so before the actual temple structure is completed, they're going to build the altar. They're going to build it on the exact foundations of the original altar that the altar that had been built under Solomon had set. And when they're doing this, it's also a time of festival. It's going to be during the time of the festival of shelters, or the festival of tents or tabernacles. It's a reminder of the Exodus when they were out in the wilderness living in tents for 40 years before they inhabited the promised land. So it's kind of interesting during this time of Exodus that we get this happening. But we see the burnt offerings are beginning to happening. The festivals are beginning to happen. They're doing all these things as they were supposed to do. They're slowly but surely rebuilding. They're starting to put new stonework together. They're bringing more cedars from Lebanon down. They're paying these things off. All of this with the authorization of King Cyrus. And so we see here in the second month, in verse 8 of chapter 3, in the second month of the second year after they arrived at God's house in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of their brothers, including the priests and all who had returned to Jerusalem from captivity, began to build, which is interesting because it's in the same month and time of the year when Solomon and his temple was built and committed to the Lord. And so we see here the Levites are being put back to work. They're going to follow David's prescription that any Levite male 20 years or older could serve. And so we see all of this beginning to happen. And they're beginning to work and supervise. They're going to and then once the foundation is built for the temple, they've at least laid the foundation. Then they'll start to build up from there. There is a time of praise and thanksgiving. They bring the musicians in. It's a time of celebration, and they're going to sing and praise. They're going to play the instruments. In fact, and these are the Levites descended from Asaph, of course, one of David's musicians and such. And so we have this interesting picture here. Then all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the Lord's house had been laid. When we enter God's house, when He's done something, we should shout. So many of us go to church and we sit on our hands, but we'll sit on Saturday and cheer a football game, or Sunday afternoon we'll cheer a football game when a guy runs a touchdown. But we should shout for God. The Bible tells us to shout for joy, shout into the rock of our salvation, right? Well, there's a great shout, but we also noticed that some of those that were older, some of the priests and such that had seen the original temple, they had lived long enough in their old age. They knew what the original temple looked like. There's weeping that's happening because they see that this temple, while good, is not as great as it had been. And so we have this picture of shouting and praising and weeping, and it's all happening at the same time. There's worship and mourning happening at the same time. And so when we get to the end of the chapter 3, we have the beginning stages of the temple, the second temple being built. Foundation has been laid. The altar has been built. Cyrus the Great has put his thumb of approval on this. We're going to see, though, tomorrow as we pick up in 4, 5, 6, 7, we're going to see they're going to start to face resistance to the building of the temple. There are going to be people within the country. They're working against them as Ezra seeks to see this process of the temple being built. And it's going to take a longer period of time than it should have. But we'll see that tomorrow. We'll pick up there in Ezra chapter 4. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a Cliff Notes explanation of what we've got going on. We're kind of jumping around a little bit, but we are the people of Israel, people of Judah are back in the land, and they are beginning to establish things. And so this book, and then when we go into Nehemiah, we're going to see the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So thank you so much. God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for Ezra chapter 4. See you then.